My name is Lynn, and I'm 54 years old. For the past 3 years, my little country house in Vermont has been my sanctuary, my pride and joy after a difficult divorce. I bought it with the money from selling the home I'd shared with my ex-husband for 25 years, and every weekend I drove 4 hours from Boston to work on it with my own two hands. It was more than just a house to me. It was my fresh start, my place of healing. But what happened next taught us both a lesson neither of us will ever forget. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about standing up for yourself when family crosses the line, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences. Now let me tell you about the weekend that changed everything between my daughter and me forever. The house itself sits nestled in the mountains of Stowe, Vermont, a charming two-bedroom cottage with the most breathtaking view of the Green Mountains you've ever seen. When I first laid eyes on it 3 years ago, the paint was peeling, the porch was sagging, and the kitchen looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But I saw potential where others saw problems. Every Friday evening after work at my financial advisory firm in Boston, I'd pack my car with tools, paint samples, and groceries, then make that long drive north. Those 4 hours became my meditation time, watching the city fade away and feeling the stress of my new single life melt with each mile. I spent my weekends learning how to tile bathrooms, refinish hardwood floors, and even how to build a proper deck. My hands got rough and my back ached, but my soul felt lighter than it had in decades. Sarah, my 29-year-old daughter, was initially my biggest supporter during those early renovation days. She'd drive up from her apartment in Cambridge on Saturdays, bringing coffee and pastries from our favorite bakery. We'd spend hours picking paint colors, debating whether the kitchen should be sage green or warm cream, and shopping at local antique stores for the perfect vintage fixtures. Those were some of our best times together. Just the two of us, covered in sawdust and paint, dreaming about what the house would become. The cottage gradually transformed into something magical. I painted the exterior a soft butter yellow with white trim, installed flower boxes under every window, and created a wraparound porch, complete with a swing where I could watch the sunrise over the mountains. Inside, I kept the original wide plank floors, but refinished them to a warm honey color. The kitchen became my masterpiece with white cabinets. I'd painted myself open shelving, displaying vintage dishes I'd collected, and a farmhouse sink that looked out over the garden I'd planted. This wasn't just a weekend getaway for me. It was where I rediscovered who Lynn was outside of being someone's wife. I'd sit on that porch in the early mornings with my coffee and journal, writing down thoughts and dreams I'd buried during my marriage. I read books I'd never had time for, took long hikes on mountain trails, and learned to appreciate the sound of absolute silence. 8 months ago, Sarah announced she was marrying David, a 32-year-old software engineer she'd been dating for 2 years. I was genuinely happy for her. David seemed stable and kind, and I could see how much he adored my daughter. The wedding was beautiful, a small ceremony in Boston, followed by a reception at a historic inn. I watched my little girl become a wife with such joy in my heart. But David came with baggage in the form of his parents, Margaret and Robert Thompson. From our first meeting, I could tell Margaret was the type of woman who believed her opinions were facts, and her preferences should be everyone's priorities. She was 62, impeccably dressed, and had a way of making suggestions that sounded more like royal decrees. Robert was quieter, but no less judgmental, with a habit of pursing his lips whenever someone mentioned spending money on anything he deemed frivolous. The Thompsons lived in a sprawling colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by manicured lawns and a 3-car garage filled with luxury vehicles they rarely drove. Despite their obvious wealth, they were surprisingly stingy about everything from restaurant tips to wedding gifts. Margaret had a particular talent for making backhanded compliments, that left you feeling diminished without quite understanding why. I began to notice changes in Sarah after the wedding. Our weekend phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I'd invite her to come up to Vermont, she'd make excuses about David's family obligations or work commitments. The warm, chatty daughter I'd raised started giving me one-word answers and seeming distracted during our conversations. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. My relationship with Sarah was shifting and not in a good direction. It was a Monday morning in early February when the call came that would change everything. I was at my office reviewing quarterly reports for a client when my phone buzzed with Sarah's name. I answered with my usual cheerful greeting, but immediately noticed something off in her voice, a combination of nervousness and forced casualness that set my maternal instincts on high alert. "Mum, I hope you're sitting down," she began, which was never a good way to start any conversation. "I have a small favor to ask." Well, actually, it's more of a heads up, since I already told them yes. My stomach dropped. In my experience, any time someone led with, "I already said yes," whatever followed was going to be problematic. She went on to explain that Margaret and Robert had been planning a family reunion for months, bringing together David's siblings and their families for what she called quality bonding time. The plan was for everyone to gather somewhere peaceful and spacious for 2 weeks in late February. Apparently, during a family dinner the previous weekend, Sarah had mentioned my Vermont house, describing its mountain views and cozy atmosphere. Margaret thought it sounded absolutely perfect. Sarah continued, her voice getting faster as she spoke. And before I really thought it through, I told them they could use it. "They're so excited, Mum. Robert even said it was the first good idea I'd had since joining the family." That last comment made my heart ache for my daughter. Since when did she need Robert Thompson's approval for her ideas to have value? I took a deep breath and tried to process what she was telling me. 12 people, 2 weeks, in my sanctuary, without asking me first. "Sarah, honey, when you say they're planning to stay there, you mean they want to rent it? Because the house isn't set up like a hotel, you know. There's no staff, no meal service, no daily housekeeping." "Oh, Mum, don't be dramatic." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's just a house. They'll bring food and clean up after themselves. Margaret is actually quite capable, you know. She managed a household of 5 children for years." I winced at her casual dismissal of my concerns and the slight emphasis she put on just a house. I tried to explain the practical issues. The house would need to be prepared for that many people, groceries would need to be purchased, linens arranged, the heating system checked, since February in Vermont could be brutal. "Plus," I added carefully, "I usually like to know when people are planning to use the house. It's still my primary retreat space." That's when Sarah's tone shifted from nervous to defensive. "I really don't see what the big deal is, Mum. You're not using it right now, and it would mean so much to David's family. They've been looking forward to this for weeks. Margaret has already researched restaurants in the area and activities for the kids." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with me trying to express my concerns, and Sarah becoming increasingly dismissive. She kept emphasizing how important this was to David's family, and how I was being unnecessarily difficult about sharing my space. By the time we hung up with Sarah, promising to call me back with more details, I felt like I'd been run over by a truck. The rest of that workday passed in a blur. I kept replaying our conversation, trying to understand how my daughter had gone from asking for a favor to making me feel selfish for having legitimate concerns about my own property. Something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, and I wasn't sure how to address it. When Sarah called back that afternoon, I could immediately tell David was listening in on the conversation. His presence seemed to make Sarah more confident, more willing to push back against my concerns. She launched into a detailed explanation of how they'd already confirmed the dates with everyone, how Margaret had researched the area thoroughly, and how disappointed everyone would be if I said no now. "We've checked, and the house has 4 bedrooms," David interjected clearly, reading from some notes. "Margaret found the listing from when you bought it. With the pull-out couch in the living room and air mattresses, there's definitely enough space for everyone." I was struck by how he spoke about my home, like he was discussing a vacation rental, complete with occupancy calculations and sleeping arrangements. I tried once more to explain that the house needed preparation for that many guests. The heating system would need to be adjusted. I'd need to stock food for 12 people, arrange for extra bedding, and ensure everything was clean and ready. "It's not that I don't want to help," I said carefully, "but this requires planning and preparation time that I haven't had." Sarah's response was swift and cutting. "Mum, you're being dramatic. It's just a house. People stay in houses all the time without requiring a week of preparation. Margaret managed a bed and breakfast for 3 summers in her 20s. She knows how to handle housekeeping." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Just a house. This wasn't just a house to me. It was the symbol of my independence, my creativity, my healing after divorce. Every room held memories of late nights, spent painting trim, or early mornings drinking coffee while planning the day's projects. The casual dismissal of something so meaningful felt like Sarah had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart. Before I could respond, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was unmistakably authoritative. "Lynn, this is Margaret Thompson, David's mother. Sarah gave me your number because we need to coordinate some details about our stay at your Vermont property." The presumption in her tone was breathtaking. She didn't ask if it was a good time to talk, or even if I'd actually agreed to host her family. She simply launched into a list of questions about the amenities, the closest grocery stores, and whether there were any restaurants within reasonable driving distance that could accommodate their dietary restrictions. "I'll need a complete list of what's available in the kitchen," she continued. "We'll be doing quite a bit of cooking, and I want to make sure you have adequate cookware for 12 people. Also, what's the internet situation Robert needs to stay connected for work, and the grandchildren will need entertainment options." I found myself speechless. Margaret was speaking as though she'd booked a confirmed reservation at a resort, complete with customer service expectations and amenity requirements. When I finally managed to interject that Sarah and I were still discussing the arrangement, Margaret's voice took on a slightly sharp edge. "Oh, I understood from Sarah that everything was settled. She specifically told us you'd agreed, and that we should go ahead with our travel plans. We've already purchased non-refundable airline tickets for 6 people." The unspoken implication was clear. Backing out now would cost her family money, and that would be my fault. That evening I called Sarah back, determined to have an honest conversation about what had happened. When she answered, I could hear David coaching her in the background, which made me even more frustrated. I explained that I'd never actually agreed to anything, and that Margaret seemed to believe the arrangement was finalized. "Oh, Mum, you're making this into such a bigger deal than it needs to be," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, dismissive and slightly condescending. "Honestly, you don't really have any rights to stop us. I'm family too, and David is my husband. We should be able to use family resources when we need them." The words hung in the air like a slap. "You don't really have any rights." My own daughter was telling me I had no rights to my own property, my own sanctuary, my own carefully crafted retreat space. David's voice came through clearly in the background. "My parents have been looking forward to this for weeks, and they've already made sacrifices to coordinate everyone's schedules." In that moment, I realized that my daughter had been completely absorbed into the Thompson family dynamic, where Margaret's wants became everyone's obligations, and questioning those wants was treated as selfishness. Sarah was no longer thinking of herself as my daughter first. She'd become a Thompson complete with their sense of entitlement and their belief that family loyalty meant never saying no. Fine, I heard myself saying, my voice surprisingly calm. Go ahead with your plans. But even as I said those words, a plan was already forming in my mind. If Sarah believed I had no rights, then perhaps it was time to show her exactly what no rights actually looked like. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the entire conversation, and feeling something I'd never experienced before. Genuine betrayal by my own daughter. This wasn't about teenage rebellion or young adult boundary testing. This was my grown daughter, whom I'd raised to be thoughtful and considerate, telling me I had no rights to my own property, while simultaneously demanding I provide free luxury accommodations for her in-laws. I found myself remembering all the weekends Sarah had spent helping me work on that house. She'd been there when I'd stripped wallpaper until my fingers were raw, when I'd painted the same wall 3 times to get the colour just right, when I'd cried from exhaustion after spending an entire Saturday installing new flooring. She'd seen how much of myself I'd poured into that place, how it represented my independence and my future. The memories came flooding back. Sarah helping me choose the perfect vintage chandelier for the dining room, the two of us laughing until our stomachs hurt when we'd accidentally painted ourselves into a corner and had to climb out the window. We'd shared so many dreams about that house planning holiday gatherings and quiet mother-daughter retreats. She'd even helped me plant the garden, carefully spacing the herbs and flowers according to the sun patterns we'd observed together. But somewhere along the way, Margaret Thompson had gotten into Sarah's head. I could see it now, the subtle ways Margaret had probably criticized me during family dinners, making comments about pushy mothers and adult children who need to establish independence. Margaret was a master manipulator, the type of woman who could make you question your own perfectly reasonable expectations while making her unreasonable demands seem completely logical. As dawn broke, I made a decision that would change everything. If Sarah and the Thompsons wanted to treat me like I had no rights, then I would show them exactly what someone with no rights would provide. If I was expected to simply hand over my house without consultation, preparation time, or even basic courtesy, then they would get exactly what someone with no power would be able to offer. Nothing. I called in sick to work and spent the morning researching property law and insurance policies. I needed to be absolutely certain that what I was planning was completely legal. The house was entirely in my name, purchased with my own money, insured under my policy alone. I had every right to control what amenities were available when guests stayed there. My plan crystallized as I drove to Vermont that Wednesday morning. If the Thompsons wanted to treat my home like a vacation rental they'd booked without paying, they would get exactly what they'd earned, shelter but nothing else. No comfort, no convenience, no hospitality, just the bare minimum that would keep them safe and legal. I thought about Sarah's words, "You don't really have any rights," and realized she was about to learn the difference between having rights and having obligations. Property owners have both, but guests who show no respect earn neither comfort nor convenience. The 4-hour drive gave me plenty of time to work out the details. I wouldn't damage anything or create any safety hazards. That would be wrong and potentially illegal. But I would remove every comfort, every convenience, every luxury that made the house a pleasant place to stay. They wanted to use my house fine. They'd get exactly what they'd asked for: 4 walls and a roof. By the time I reached Vermont, I felt calmer than I had in days. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way, and this was going to be one of those times. Sarah was about to discover that respect and courtesy aren't old-fashioned concepts. They're the foundation of healthy relationships, even between family members. I spent the next 3 days methodically preparing my house for the most uncomfortable legal stay possible. Every decision I made was carefully considered to ensure I stayed within my rights, while making it crystal clear that comfort and convenience are privileges earned through respect, not entitlements that come with family connections. First, I addressed the heating situation. February in Vermont can be brutally cold, with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing. I couldn't turn off the heat entirely. That would be dangerous and could cause pipes to freeze, creating real damage. Instead, I adjusted the thermostat to 45 degrees, the absolute minimum safe temperature that would prevent freezing while ensuring everyone would be thoroughly uncomfortable. I also manually adjusted the furnace settings and removed the thermostat's batteries, making it impossible for guests to increase the temperature without significant mechanical knowledge. Next, I tackled the food situation. The Thompsons had made it clear through Margaret's demands that they expected a fully stocked kitchen ready for their culinary needs. I spent an entire afternoon removing everything edible from the house. The refrigerator, which I'd normally stock with basic staples like milk, eggs, and fresh vegetables, was completely emptied. The pantry, usually filled with pasta, rice, canned goods, and baking supplies, was stripped bare, in a move that I admit gave me considerable satisfaction. I left behind exactly 3 items: one loaf of day-old bread from the local grocery store, a half-empty jar of generic peanut butter, and a single can of store-brand chicken soup. I placed these items prominently on the kitchen counter with a note that read, "Enjoy your meal." The nearest full grocery store was a 45-minute drive down winding mountain roads, a fact I was certain Margaret hadn't researched during her planning. The bedding situation required more careful consideration. I couldn't leave them without any bedding at all, as that could constitute an unsafe situation, especially given the temperature I'd set for the house. Instead, I removed all the comfortable down comforters, high thread count sheets, and plush pillows I'd carefully selected for the house. In their place, I left thin polyester blankets that looked like they'd come from a budget motel, scratchy bottom sheets that had seen better days, and flat pillows that provided about as much comfort as folded towels. I made sure each bed had the absolute minimum: one thin sheet, one worn blanket, and one sad excuse for a pillow. The beautiful quilts I'd collected from local artisans went into storage, along with the luxurious Egyptian cotton sheets I'd splurged on for the master bedroom. The bathroom preparations were particularly satisfying. I removed all the plush towels, leaving behind 2 thin, rough towels that felt like sandpaper against skin. The basket of expensive toiletries I usually provided for guests, lavender shampoo, moisturizing body wash, luxury soaps, disappeared completely. In their place, I left 2 rolls of the cheapest toilet paper I could find, and a tiny bar of hotel soap that looked like it had been sitting in someone's travel bag for months. Technology was my next target. I called the internet provider and requested a temporary service suspension, citing maintenance issues. The cable company received a similar call. Margaret had specifically mentioned needing internet for Robert's work and entertainment for the grandchildren. Well, they'd have to figure out alternative arrangements. The beautiful stone fireplace had always been one of the house's most charming features, especially during cold Vermont winters. I'd spent considerable time and money building up a supply of properly seasoned firewood, neatly stacked and ready for cozy evening fires. Every single log went into the locked garage, along with the fire-starting supplies, leaving behind a cold, empty hearth that mocked any dreams of romantic mountain evenings. My final touch was a note carefully crafted to seem sweet and welcoming, while delivering a message that would be impossible to miss. I placed it prominently on the kitchen table, written in my neatest handwriting on expensive stationery. "Welcome to my house. I'm so sorry I couldn't be here to greet you personally. Since you felt I had no rights to say no to this arrangement, I figured I also had no obligation to prepare for your comfort. I hope you enjoy discovering what no rights actually looks like. The house is all yours. Every cold, empty, uncomfortable inch of it. Love and best wishes for a memorable stay. Lynn. I also left the most recent heating bill and property tax notices prominently displayed, making sure they'd understand exactly how much money it took to maintain their free accommodations. Before leaving, I installed a small legal security camera system, with my contractor's permission positioned to monitor the common areas without invading privacy. I wanted to witness their reactions not out of cruelty, but because I needed to see if this lesson would have any impact on their entitled attitudes. I checked into a comfortable bed and breakfast, about 20 minutes away, close enough to respond if there were any real emergencies, but far enough away to avoid any unplanned confrontations. From my cozy room with its warm fire and complimentary wine and cheese, I settled in to watch the drama unfold via my phone's security app. As I reviewed my preparations one final time, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. I took no joy in making anyone uncomfortable, but sometimes dramatic lessons are the only ones that stick. Sarah was about to learn that respect and consideration aren't old-fashioned concepts. They're the foundation of healthy relationships, especially within families. Friday evening arrived with the kind of bitter February cold that makes your breath visible and your bones ache. I watched from my warm bed and breakfast room as the Thompson family convoy pulled into my driveway just after 6 p.m. 3 vehicles, 2 luxury SUVs and a minivan, slowly made their way up the winding drive, their headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. Through my security camera app, I had a perfect view of the front door as Margaret emerged from the lead vehicle, bundled in an expensive wool coat and clearly eager to take charge of the situation. Robert followed more slowly along with David's 2 siblings and their families. I could see children bouncing excitedly in the background, probably thrilled about their mountain vacation. Margaret marched up to the front door with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. She used the key Sarah had given her and pushed open the door, immediately stepping into the frigid air of the house. Even through the grainy camera footage, I could see her breath forming visible clouds as she walked into what should have been a warm, welcoming entryway. The confusion on her face was immediate and unmistakable. She stopped just inside the doorway, looking around as if she'd entered the wrong house. I watched her pull out her phone, probably checking the address or texting Sarah. Behind her, other family members began filing in, and I could see their posture change as the cold hit them. "Why is it so cold in here?" I could hear one of the children asking through the camera's audio pickup. Margaret was already heading toward the thermostat, her movements becoming more agitated by the second. I watched with satisfaction as she discovered the missing batteries and began pushing buttons that no longer responded. David appeared in the frame, and I could see him talking animatedly on his phone, undoubtedly calling Sarah in a panic. He began examining the heating system with the confidence of someone who worked with technology, but I knew he'd find nothing obviously wrong. The furnace was functioning perfectly at exactly the temperature I'd set. The discovery process continued as family members dispersed throughout the house, each one apparently uncovering new disappointments. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the camera as she discovered the empty refrigerator. "There's absolutely nothing here, not even basic condiments." I watched Robert examine the sad selection I'd left on the counter: the stale bread, nearly empty peanut butter jar, and single can of soup. His expression was priceless, a combination of confusion and growing indignation. These were people accustomed to having their needs anticipated and met without question. The children's voices grew louder and more complaining as they discovered there was no internet, no cable television, and no entertainment options beyond whatever they'd brought with them. "This place is boring," one young voice declared. "And why is it so cold? My breath is smoky." Margaret's phone call to Sarah was the moment I'd been waiting for. Even through the camera's limited audio, I could hear her voice rising as she described the situation. Sarah, what exactly did you tell your mother we needed? This house is freezing. There's no food, and it feels like we're camping, not staying in a family home. I could only imagine Sarah's side of that conversation, probably filled with confusion and growing panic as she realized something had gone very wrong. Margaret continued her tirade. Your mother has provided literally nothing for our comfort. Nothing. We drove 6 hours to stay in what amounts to an unheated cabin. David's attempts to problem solve were admirable, but futile. I watched him try to adjust heating vents, examine circuit breakers, and even attempt to start a fire before discovering the complete absence of firewood. His engineering background was useless against a problem that wasn't technical in nature. By 8 p.m., the family had made the decision to drive to the nearest town in search of food and supplies. Watching 3 carloads of frustrated cold people bundle back into their vehicles and head down the dark mountain road gave me a moment of satisfaction, mixed with sympathy for the children who were innocent victims of their grandparents' entitlement. The grocery store expedition took nearly 3 hours, longer than I'd expected, which suggested they'd had trouble finding what they needed or had possibly stopped for dinner somewhere warm. When they returned laden with bags of hastily purchased supplies, the house was even colder, and their mood had clearly deteriorated further. Saturday morning brought phone calls that I'd been anticipating. Sarah called me at 7 a.m., her voice a mixture of tears and fury. Mom, how could you do this to us? Margaret is absolutely livid, and the kids are miserable. What were you thinking? I let her vent for several minutes before responding in the calmest voice I could manage. Sarah, sweetie, you told me I had no rights to say no to this arrangement. Well, people who have no rights don't have obligations either. I provided exactly what someone with no power would be able to offer: shelter. But this is humiliating, she cried. Margaret thinks our entire family is crazy, and David is furious with both of us. You're making me look terrible in front of my in-laws. I'm not making you look like anything, I replied. I'm simply showing you what happens when you take someone's generosity for granted and dismiss their legitimate concerns as unimportant. You said this was just a house that I was being dramatic about. Well, now you get to experience this just a house without any of the love and preparation that usually makes it special. The call ended with Sarah hanging up on me, but not before I heard Margaret's voice in the background making threats about legal action and demands that Sarah control her mother's behavior. By Sunday morning, my security cameras showed a very different scene. The Thompson family was packing up their vehicles with considerably less enthusiasm than they'd shown upon arrival. Children were crying, adults were arguing, and Margaret looked like she hadn't slept in days. The final confrontation came in the form of a phone call from Margaret herself. Her voice was icy with controlled rage as she informed me that my behavior was unconscionable and that she would be advising David and Sarah to cut contact with me entirely. You've shown your true colors, she declared, and they're ugly indeed. I listened to her entire speech without interruption, then responded in my most pleasant voice. Margaret, you're absolutely welcome to never ask to use my house again. In fact, I'd prefer it. The click as she hung up was almost as satisfying as watching her pack her bags on my security camera. By Sunday afternoon, all 3 vehicles had disappeared down the mountain road, leaving my house empty and peaceful once again. I drove up from the bed and breakfast to restore the heat, restock the food, and return the comfortable bedding to where it belonged. As I worked to make my house feel like home again, I reflected on what I'd accomplished. The lesson had been taught, but now came the harder part, dealing with the aftermath and hoping my daughter had learned something valuable about respect and consideration in the process. The first week after the Thompson family's abbreviated Vermont vacation was the longest of my life. I'd won the battle, but at what felt like the cost of the war. My relationship with Sarah seemed to be collateral damage in my effort to teach a lesson about respect and boundaries. Initially, the silence from Sarah was deafening. My calls went straight to voicemail. My texts remained unread, and for the first time since she'd learned to talk, my daughter had completely shut me out of her life. I spent sleepless nights wondering if I'd taken things too far, if teaching a lesson about respect was worth potentially losing my relationship with my only child. My friends, when I finally worked up the courage to share what had happened, surprised me with their overwhelming support. Janet, my closest friend since college, actually laughed when I described the empty refrigerator and missing firewood. "Good for you," she said firmly. "Sarah needed to learn that being married doesn't mean she gets to steamroll her mother. Margaret sounds like a nightmare, and your daughter was becoming just like her." Even my ex-husband, usually critical of any parenting decisions I made independently, called to offer his support after Sarah apparently complained to him about the situation. "Lynn, you did the right thing," he said, which shocked me more than anything else that had happened. Sarah was out of line, and sometimes kids need to learn lessons the hard way, even adult kids. But the real surprise came on Wednesday evening, exactly 1 week after the Vermont disaster. My phone rang, and David's name appeared on the caller ID. I almost didn't answer, expecting another angry confrontation or demands for an apology. Instead, I heard a voice that sounded exhausted and genuinely remorseful. "Lynn, I owe you an apology," David began, which was not what I'd expected to hear. "I've spent the past week thinking about what happened, and I realize my family was completely out of line. We had no right to expect you to provide free accommodations without even asking properly, and my mother's behavior was unacceptable." He went on to explain that the car ride home had been a nightmare with his parents, complaining non-stop about my inhospitable treatment, while he'd gradually realized how entitled and demanding they'd been. "My mother actually expected you to stock groceries and prepare the house like we were paying guests at a resort," he said. "When I really thought about it, I was horrified by how we'd treated you." More importantly, David had apparently had serious conversations with Sarah about her attitude toward me and the influence his parents were having on their marriage. "Sarah has been struggling to fit in with my family," he admitted, "and I think she thought the way to do that was to adopt their attitudes about everything, including their dismissive treatment of your feelings and property rights." That conversation gave me hope, but I still hadn't heard directly from Sarah herself. That changed on Friday afternoon when she called, her voice small and shaky, in a way that reminded me of when she was little and had done something she knew was wrong. "Mum, can we talk face to face? I think I need to apologize for a lot of things," she said. We arranged to meet that Saturday at a small cafe halfway between Boston and her apartment neutral territory, where we could speak honestly without the pressure of being in either of our homes. When I walked into the cafe and saw my daughter sitting at a corner table, she looked older somehow, as if the events of the past month had forced her to grow up in ways she hadn't expected. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she'd been crying recently, and she stood up to hug me with a desperation that broke my heart. "I'm so sorry, Mum," were the first words out of her mouth, and they came with fresh tears. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I can't believe how I treated you. I can't believe the things I said." What followed was the most honest conversation Sarah and I had shared in months. She explained how overwhelming it had been to join David's family, how Margaret had a way of making her feel constantly judged and criticized. She kept making comments about how close you and I were, suggesting it was unhealthy for a married woman to be so dependent on her mother's approval, Sarah said. "I thought the way to prove my independence was to put distance between us." She also admitted that Margaret had been subtly criticizing me for months, making comments about pushy mothers who didn't know when to step back and let their adult children make their own decisions. I started seeing your legitimate concerns as interference instead of caring, Sarah confessed. Margaret made it seem like demanding to use your house was a reasonable test of family loyalty. The conversation lasted for over 3 hours, with Sarah gradually understanding how completely she'd abandoned her own values in an attempt to please her new in-laws. She'd allowed Margaret to reframe my reasonable boundaries as selfishness and my desire to be consulted as controlling behavior. The worst part, Sarah said toward the end of our talk, is that I knew better. I knew you'd put your heart and soul into that house. I knew how much it meant to you. But Margaret made it seem like my loyalty to David meant I had to choose between you and his family. I explained to Sarah that healthy relationships don't require choosing sides or proving loyalty through disrespect toward other people you love. Margaret manipulated you into believing that being a good wife meant being a bad daughter, I said. But that's not how love works. Love multiplies. It doesn't divide. We spent the final hour of our conversation planning how to rebuild our relationship and establish boundaries with David's family going forward. Sarah had already spoken to David about limiting his parents' influence on their marriage, and he'd been surprisingly supportive once he understood how manipulative his mother had been. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Sarah asked if she could come up to Vermont the following weekend to help me prepare the house for spring. I want to remember why that place is special, she said. I want to remember what it felt like to work on something together instead of fighting about it. The drive home felt lighter than any journey I'd taken in months. My daughter had learned a valuable lesson about respect and boundaries, but more importantly, she'd learned to recognize manipulation and stand up for her own values. Margaret Thompson's attempt to drive a wedge between us had ultimately made our relationship stronger. That weekend in Vermont became the foundation for rebuilding our mother-daughter bond. Working side by side to winterize the houseplant new flowers and repair the damage that winter had done to the deck, we talked through the events of recent months and established new patterns of communication. Sarah apologized repeatedly for her behavior, but I reminded her that growing up sometimes means making mistakes and learning from them. The important thing, I told her as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, is that you recognized what was happening and chose to change it. During our conversations, I learned that Margaret had been even more manipulative than I'd realized, making comments designed to make Sarah feel guilty about our close relationship, and suggesting that my involvement in her life was preventing her from fully committing to David. It was classic divide and conquer strategy, and Sarah had fallen for it completely. I almost lost the most important woman in my life because I was trying to impress a woman who was never going to accept me anyway, Sarah reflected. Margaret doesn't want daughters-in-law. She wants servants who happen to be married to her sons. The transformation in Sarah was remarkable. She'd rediscovered her own voice and her own values, remembering that she'd been raised to treat people with kindness and consideration. She'd also learned to recognize emotional manipulation and resist its skills that would serve her well in her marriage and in life. Our relationship emerged from this crisis stronger than it had ever been. We'd both learned valuable lessons. I'd learned that sometimes you have to fight for respect, even from people you love. And Sarah had learned that you can't build new relationships by tearing down existing ones. 6 months later, when David suggested having another family gathering, Sarah firmly but kindly explained that they'd be renting a proper vacation rental where everyone could be comfortable and the hosts would be properly compensated for their efforts. Margaret wasn't happy about the change, but she'd learned that Sarah was no longer willing to sacrifice other relationships to please her. That little house in Vermont taught us both something invaluable: respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who need to learn that lesson the hardest way. The view from my porch is still beautiful. The morning coffee still tastes perfect. And now the memories include not just healing and independence, but also the knowledge that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and teaching respect sometimes requires uncomfortable lessons. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who took your generosity for granted? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes we all need reminding that it's okay to set boundaries with people we love. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear that respect and kindness should flow in both directions, even in family relationships. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about navigating difficult family dynamics and finding your voice when it matters most. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your home, your rules, your peace of mind matter just as much as anyone else's. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.